For much of the 20th century, Venezuela's military was just that, a military, an institution built for the national defense of Venezuela, trained in the Western tradition, largely apolitical, and though imperfect, at least pretending to be professional. That was before it became a bloated, politicized, and thoroughly corrupt apparatus for personal enrichment, drug trafficking, and the occasional bout of domestic repression. This is the story of how you dismantle a military. Before the so-called Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela's military was known simply as the Fuerza Armada Nacional. Like most Latin American armies, it was organized into 4 distinct branches: the Ejército, the Army, the Armada, the Navy, Aviación Militar, Air Force, and the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard. Each had its own command, structure, doctrine, and sense of purpose. The National Guard back then wasn't a riot control division for breaking up student protests. It was meant for border security and counter-narcotics. The Army's primary concern was defending Venezuelan sovereignty, not food distribution. And the Air Force, well, it had actual planes that could fly. What the military wasn't, however, was a personal army for whoever happened to be sitting in Miraflores. Of course, that's not to say the military had always been neutral. For much of Venezuela's history, the line between military and government was blurred, if not outright non-existent. From the caudillo era of the 19th century to the rise of the military strongmen in the early 20th, force was often the defining factor in political power. It wasn't until Eleazar López Contreras took office in 1935, following the death of Juan Vicente Gómez, that the groundwork for a true separation between the armed forces and civilian government began to take shape. His policies introduced a shift toward institutional stability, laying a foundation for what would eventually become Venezuela's democratic order. But the military did hold power when it wanted to. Marcos Pérez Jiménez proved that in the 1950s. His military-backed dictatorship showed that, given the right conditions, the armed forces could seize control of the country. And yet, after his fall in 1958, something remarkable happened. Instead of permanently holding onto power, the military allowed a return to civilian rule. And for the next 40 years, Venezuela's military remained a traditional structured force. Yes, it was powerful, but it wasn't ideological. It wasn't fused to the government, and crucially, it wasn't a personal extension of the president. That would all begin to unravel in the 1990s. The first real sign of trouble came in 1992. A young lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chávez led a coup attempt President Carlos Andrés Pérez. It failed and Chávez was imprisoned, but he learned something critical. Not all of the military was loyal to the government. Some were willing to turn against the system. He just needed time. In 1994, newly elected President Rafael Caldera pardoned Chávez, releasing him from prison. Free and with a growing public image, Chávez wasted no time. He launched a nationwide campaign, rebranding himself not as a failed coup leader, but as a man of the people. By 1998, he was running for the presidency. Chávez wins the presidency, and from day one he knows that the traditional military leadership won't automatically bend the knee. Solution? A purge. Gradually at first, then all at once. The first step? A new constitution. In 1999, redefining the military's mission. No longer just a national defense force, it now had a role in national development. A vague and dangerous pivot. Then came the forced retirements. Generals too loyal to the old guard were encouraged in that charming, authoritarian way to step aside. At the same time, Chávez accelerated military promotions, handing out ranks at an unprecedented pace. Officers who demonstrated ideological loyalty were catapulted into high positions overnight, regardless of experience. What should have taken decades of service could now be achieved with the right amount of loyalty. The result? A military no longer devoted to national defense, but to Chávez himself. In 2005, Chávez did what all good autocrats do. He changed the branding. The Fuerza Armada Nacional became the Fuerza Armada Nacional Bolivariana. This wasn't just a name change, it was an ideological overhaul. Every officer had to swear allegiance, not to Venezuela, but to the Bolivarian Revolution. Chávez didn't just want a loyal military, he wanted a unified one. So he centralized power. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and National Guard, they still existed in name, but now they all answered directly to him. A fragmented military can rebel. A monolithic one controlled by a single doctrine, cannot. Then came the next step, the creation of the Bolivarian Militia, armed civilians trained separately from the traditional forces directly loyal to Chávez. It was a classic Cuban tactic, create a parallel force so that if your traditional military ever turns against you, you have a second option. By the time Chávez was done, Venezuela's military was no longer an army in the traditional sense. It was a political organization with weapons. To solidify control, Chávez also ensured that Venezuelans themselves would be disarmed. Under the guise of reducing crime, the government launched a widespread gun control measure, stripping civilians, including retired military officers, of their weapons. Even former lieutenants like my grandfather were ordered to surrender their service pistols. A disarmed populace, a military loyal to the presidency, not the constitution, the chessboard was set. If Chávez corrupted the military, Maduro would then criminalize it. Under his rule, military officers were no longer just political enforcers. They became businessmen, drug traffickers, and warlords. So if you ever find yourself in power and want to dismantle your country's military, here's a blueprint. Purges and promotions, remove professionals, promote sycophants. Rebrand and reorganize, change the mission, rewrite the doctrine. Corrupt and criminalize, make the military an economic cartel. Do that and you'll never have to worry about coups again. Your military won't be defending the country, it'll be defending you. Good luck.